Hi and welcome to hand one of the Poker Thought Processes example videos. I've put this together to demonstrate how Tops Apgod H and Tspar Bapgod H work in practice. Your main focus should be on the process itself rather than getting too bogged down in the details of the hands. You can follow along using the PDF document with the tree diagram of questions, or you can pause the video and test your memory and try and predict what I'm going to say next. How exactly you use these examples is up to you. You're going to see the whole process in operation, and it's a lot to take in. When you try and practice this on your own, the first few times are going to be tough. Take note of the parts you find difficult or the bits you forget. These are the elements you need to drill through multiple times. In these examples, I'm doing the whole process all together, but that's not necessarily the way you should go about practicing it. Remember, you can take it one element at a time. Spend as long as you need to on a single element until you gain proficiency. For the first example, I'm using a hand played by Pluribus, a software program which recently played a group of high-stakes 6-max cash players. The reason I've chosen a hand played by artificial intelligence is that it maintains the focus on GTO play. It's also interesting. That said, remember that this whole process will work not just with any no-limit hold'em hand, but you can also use this for other variations of poker too. In example 1, we're playing as Pluribus. I'm going to try and apply human thoughts to the machine's decisions using Tops Apgod H and Tspar Bapgod H. In this example, I'll just answer the questions without asking them, so you get a more fluent commentary. But in the other examples, I will ask the questions before answering them, so you experience the full drill in action. We're in a 6-max cash game, so we can skip tournament situation, though it's worth noting we're playing at a table with some of the best players in the world, so our focus should be less on exploitation and more on optimal play. You will notice that the thought process for hands like this one, with no tournament dynamics and no real exploitation of villains, is much simpler and faster. That might surprise those of you who play exploitative poker. How can GTO poker be simpler and faster? Well, that's because to exploit properly, you need to understand GTO anyway. Let's press on. There are 6 players at the table, so I need to stay active and remember typical 6-max frequencies. For example, a normal VPIP here is going to be around 26. I don't have access to my opponent's statistics, but I can assume the standard will be excellent. They will be thinking on a deep level against each other, beyond level 2, picking up on frequency errors. But their image of me will be that I'm close to optimal, playing in a style which includes a lot of randomization. They might be more likely to make hero calls against me, as they know I'll be bluffing in spots that human players might not bluff. I'm positioned in this hand on the big blind, so I'm keeping in mind my defending ranges against the various positions on the table. I'm using optimal calling and 3-bet frequencies, and I have no reason to deviate from those ranges. I've noted where each villain is sat, but I view them all equally at this point. Each player is 100 big blinds deep, so there are no complications with stack sizes. The cards are dealt, and the action falls around to the small blind, who raises to a standard 3 big blinds. I have to call 2 into a pot of 4, so my pot odds are 33%. When I 3-bet, I like to use a sizing of 3.5 times his bet. Here that presents odds of 36% to my opponent. The small blind's GTO range for raising should be around 32%. That should consist of most Ace-X and King-X combinations, most pocket pair combinations, Queen-9 and better, both suited and unsuited, and Jack-10 suited. Because we're heads up and he's out of position, his raising range is quite high card dominated. So it's less likely to include suited, connected type hands. My GTO response is to continue 76% of the time and fold 24% of the time. My 3-bet range is something around 14.5%, consisting of suited aces, ace-8 offsuit and better, king-jack off and better, and queen-jack suited and better, plus all the pocket pairs except 2-2. Some of these hands cross into my calling range too. I'm going to call with nearly everything else as my pot odds are so good. I'll fold the really weak offsuited hands which make up that 24% folding range. If I now consider what my opponent is actually raising with, I have no reason to think it differs from what is optimal. Therefore, I'm going to go straight to my hole cards, which I can reveal are ace, king. Ace, king, I 3-bet with a 100% frequency, and I've got no reason to change my normal sizing, so I'll go ahead and raise to 10.5 big blinds. Ace, king is towards the top end of my 3-bet range, so I'd be continuing 100% of the time against a 4-bet. Now, the small blind just calls, and that takes us to the post-flop action. Before the cards are dealt, I'm honing in on my opponent. I'm thinking that he's likely to check most of his range to me post-flop. I'll then need to consider the board and my c-betting frequency. The pot is 21 big blinds. Both of our stacks are 89.5 big blinds. So the stack to pot ratio is around 4.5, which is quite small and typical for a 3-bet pot. It means there's a strong chance of playing for stacks here, which I need to be aware of when making any post-flop bets. If I wanted to play for stacks at an SPR of 4.5, possible betting lines include 50% flop, 50% turn, 75% river, or 40% flop, 40% turn, 100% river. And I'm aware of that even going in to the post-flop action. I'm keeping those sizings in mind. I have position on the villain and I'm the aggressor as he only called my 3-bet. His range for raising pre-flop was 32%, but from that range he would have folded to my 3-bet around a third of those hands. So I think he would have 4-bet with, say, Jack, Jack plus, Ace, King, maybe a few balancing hands. That leaves around 17% of the hands in his starting range that he would actually have just called the 3-bet with. The flop is dealt and the board is 6 of hearts, 9 of hearts, 9 of clubs. It's a paired board with a flush draw and a few straight draw possibilities. It hasn't hit either player's range very well as there are no high cards. The villain will have missed this totally around 70 to 75% of the time. I carry through a range advantage from the pre-flop action as the villain's range is capped, having failed to 4-bet. The villain does check to me, leaving me in what I like to call post-flop scenario 1 or PS1. This simply means I'm the aggressor in position facing a check. It's the best of the post-flop scenarios to be in. I'm not really thinking too much about pot odds here, but if I bet half the pot, I present 25% odds to my opponent, which is a perfectly rational thing to do here. Machines don't care about who the aggressor is beyond the range advantage, but humans do. So an out of position human is much more likely to check his entire range here than a computer. The GTO checking range here is 92%, with a balanced 8% donk betting range, which consists of some very strong hands plus a few hands with decent equity. So the GTO check actually weakens the villain's range slightly more than the human's check, which is usually 100%. My own GTO response here is to c-bet with almost a 100% frequency. My range is strong and there's nothing to fear from my opponent. So I can skip straight through to my action at this point unless I feel that my opponent's range differs hugely from the GTO range. I don't feel that, but I will note that my human opponent is probably trapping more often with his strong hands than a machine would. So my hand strength within my c-betting range here is marginal to good. I'll hold ace high around 44% of the time, with a stronger hand around 30% of the time. I don't have the ace of hearts, which means that that's more likely to be in my opponent's range. My range's equity against my opponent is around 60-40, and my hand is doing slightly better than that at around 64% equity. With all that having been rolling around my mind, I go ahead and make the c-bet. The villain does check call, and I will need to consider carefully how this narrows his range. He will likely check the turn to me. And note the pot is 42 bigs with 79 left behind, so 2 normal bets would just about put us all in. I'm thinking about what cards from my opponent's range he would have just check called the flop with. This call is significant. Either he has a very strong hand that he's slow playing, perhaps maybe 15-20% of the time, or he's got like a marginal hand with some equity, such as ace queen, ace jack, small pocket pair, maybe a draw of some description. I'm trying to do this analysis before he checks the turn, so I'm analysing the action twice, not once. If I'm not fast enough, I'll have to do it all at the same time. The turn card is the 7 of diamonds. This does not help me, and his range has narrowed much more than mine, so I consider my range to be possibly slightly behind his now. The fact that the board has straight dangers is less significant than the overall shift in range strength. There weren't that many straights in either of our ranges. He does check to me again, which I believe he should do with all of his hands. My GTO reply is to check most of my marginal hands which have equity, and to bet with my value hands and a few drawing hands. That means betting half the pot with a frequency of around 40% or 71 combinations, and checking behind with 60% of my hands or 106 combinations. Once again, I've got no reason to deviate from GTO play here, as I'm sure my opponent is playing close to optimally in this hand. As a result, I can skip straight through to considering my hand itself. I'm holding the ace of diamonds, king of spades, which of all the combos of ace king is one of the best to be, I think the best to be holding. By not having a heart or a club, it's more likely the villain has those cards in his hand, and we want him to hold flush draws at this point. Our range equity has dropped to about 44%, and our hand has around 43% equity. Interestingly, if we had the ace of hearts, our equity would be as low as 37%. This is because the ace X of hearts makes up quite a large chunk of his drawing range. If we take that away, he's got a lot more value hands, made hands that are strong in his range, hence his equity goes up. The hand we hold with the diamond and the spade, we can bet about 20% of the time. It's a mixed strategy. There are GTO complexities around which combinations of ace king you should prefer to bet with and which you should prefer to check with. I'm not going to go into those details now. Suffice to say, you ought to be checking back most of your marginal hands, and ace king is now a marginal hand sitting slap bang in the middle of your range. Pre-flop, it was at the very top of your range. On the flop, it had weakened, but it was still strong, and now it is definitely just marginal, bang in the middle of your range. I go ahead and check back the turn. I think briefly about my opponent and what his likely river behavior will be. Will he sense weakness and look to push me off a marginal hand by betting big at the river, or will he fail to bluff with enough combinations? Once again, I'll have to assume he's going to play well and stick to finding an optimal response. There's still 42 big blinds in the middle with 79 left behind. So overbets, pot size bets and smaller bets are all possible. I expect the villain to value bet rather than check raise with most of his strong hands. So if he checks, it's unlikely he'll have much, and I'll have the opportunity of using my position either to apply pressure or to check behind and release the showdown equity in my hand. As the action on the turn was check, there's not much left to consider. Crucially, we believe he checked with all of his hands, which means no range reduction took place, and we can simply proceed to the post-flop action. The river card is the King of Diamonds, which connects both with our range and our hand. His range had more drawing hands in it, and this card doesn't help any of them. So although his range is still stronger than ours, the river card does not help improve his situation much. He did have King X combinations in his range, but so did we. Overall, this is not a river card which I expect him to be able to bet at very often. That should really help us navigate the action in position. He does still have nut hands in his range though, which we don't have as often since we failed to bet the turn. Optimally, he should probably bet this river with those nut hands plus a few combinations of missed draws. He actually checks to us, which he should do 85% of the time. That leaves us to consider our GTO response. What can we get value from? Top pair and better seems reasonable. That would put him in a tough spot with some pocket pairs. Top pair and better represents just around 24% of our hand range right now. It's not many hands, but we need to choose a bet size and a bluffing frequency. Pot size and 1/3 bluffs is a go-to frequency that works nicely in many spots. If we do this, we need to find 24% divided by 3, which would be 8% bluffing hands from 106 combinations. That's 8 or 9 hands. All I actually have to choose from are 4 Queen Jack suited combos and a few weak Ace X hands. They're the only bluffing combos that I've got in my range right now. But that's enough. I need these combos to balance my range, and I can still fold these hands to anything he check raise shoves. All my marginal hands like Ace Jack off and better, I simply check back and slow down. So I'm betting pot size with 1/3 of my hands and checking the rest. Having built my GTO ranges, are there any reasons to assume my opponent will overfold or overcall here? Possibly he might overcall with pocket pairs such as pocket 8s, 5s and 4s. He also has a few combos of Ace Queen and Ace Jack that might cause him a problem, but I'm not really sure if he will get his frequencies wrong or not. For that reason, I'm sticking to my GTO range and making the pot size bet. If I had the Ace of Hearts, there would be a case for just checking back, as my opponent's range would contain fewer Ace X combos and more hands that beat me. But I have no Ace of Hearts, so I can definitely get some value from my hand. And that actually ends my thought processes for the hand, as my opponent just called and showed up with Ace of Hearts and Queen of Clubs, highlighting the importance of the Ace of Hearts in this hand. Join me in the second example for a live MTT hand featuring yours truly.